Hi, my name is Joy Axelson, and I work with the English Online SBS. I've worked at the English Online SBS since 2008. Today, in this session, we're going to be looking at the big picture of Amos. Now, this is your first prophet that you're going to do your vertical charts, BRI, horizontal for. And I would like to start with asking you two questions. Number one, what are your concerns, your fears, or apprehensions with starting with the prophets? You know, often believers today just look at the prophets for predictions for the future. And they just think, oh, the rest of the prophets is just sin and judgment over and over and over again. And often people say that what the prophets have in general, it's confusing language, it's not understandable. And often that's because they don't understand the type of literature it is. They don't understand the oracles, the symbolic acts, the visions or parables or the poetry. You know, there are many things in the prophets that doesn't relate to our culture and time. But the second question I want to ask you is, what are you excited about? And what do you look forward to with starting the prophets? Because through doing the SBS, you're able to understand the prophets and their historical setting. You can see God's heart for Israel and Judah, to give them hope, to bring them back to the law. So our goal as we approach the prophets is to learn how the prophets communicate and why they do so, in order to help us understand the original reader and the original audience, and to link the prophecies with their fulfillments in history to Christ and to the church. There is a danger as we approach the prophets in the church today, because often people just look for predictions related to Jesus or the future and forget about the rest of the prophets. But this can lead to misunderstanding about what a prophet is saying. You know, it's important to understand the type of literature, to understand its meaning to the original audience or the original hearers, and to the original readers, to truly grasp the meaning of the prophets. Now, in our unit before this, to the Introduction to Prophetic Literature, I gave you a handout called Interpreting the Prophets, and I just want to review that handout now, and it has several tips to help you. Tip number one, consider the historical situation. The world during the time of the prophets was a time of political and social upheaval. Israel and Judah were unfaithful to the covenant, idolatry ran rapid, and there was a general disregard for the covenant. It was in these circumstances that God raised up the prophets to speak His word into His people's lives. Let's read Amos chapter 1, verse 1. And it says, "The word of Amos, who was among the shepherds of Tekoa, when he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joaz, the king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake." So this gives us the historical setting of the book of Amos. It was during Uzziah and during Jeroboam II. We will talk more about this in another lecture, but it's important to remember that during the 300 years of the written prophets, there was much going on in Israel and Judah's history. There was much political and military and social upheaval. There was religious unfaithfulness and disregard to the Old Testament covenant. There were shifting populations as they were being conquered by different world powers. And so the BRI will help you very much with considering the historical situation. Tip number 2, consider the literary form. Consider the literary forms found in the prophets, such as poetry, Hebrew parallelism, oracles, the enacted symbols, the historical narrative, laments, apocalyptic literature, or figures of speech. Now, Amos, some of the literary forms that we see in this book, of course, is Hebrew poetry, but Amos is very kind to us and is very clear with his oracles, with the lawsuit, with woe, with the promise, and visions. He also has a lament in his book. We will look at these things as we go throughout the book. Tip number 3, understand the use of figurative language. Prophetic literature, like other biblical poetry, is rich in figurative language. Understanding the figurative language use in the prophetic literature is imperative for good interpretation. And you can see the handout, the figures of speech, which will help you with this. Tip number 4, consider the context. Tip number 5, look for the main idea. Don't try to take every verse. It's not like teachings of the letters in the New Testament, but you want to look at each verse or each section and not try to get a meaning out of every single word, but what is the main idea of that verse or those verses. Tip number 6, the New Testament interprets the Old Testament. Look for New Testament quotes of the Old Testament passages. So you have a handout that has all of the quotes from the Old Testament that are listed in the New Testament. And look at what does the New Testament say about this passage? How does the New Testament interpret it? And what does the New Testament give as the fulfillment? And so this is important to do in each of your prophetic books, to look at this handout and to see which of those Old Testament prophets is mentioned in the New Testament and to interpret that. Tip number 7, consider the Hebrew mindset. The Hebrew mindset was formed by key events in their history, such as creation, the fall of man, Abraham, Isaac, the tribes, the promised land, the promise of blessing, election, that Israel was God's chosen. You have the wilderness, the Exodus, the conquest, the covenant blessing and curses, David and God's promise to him, the temple, the monarchy. So whenever a prophet makes reference to these events in history's past, remember to consider the lesson or the significance of these events to the people of Israel, to the original hearer and to the original reader. These can also be called as motifs, which is a repeated imagery or theme that occurs in the Old Testament to provide a concept that would be clear to the original reader to describe the current or future events. Now in Amos, there are several Old Testament historical events or motifs. An example is of the Exodus and the wilderness. So let's look at a couple of references to this. Let's read Amos chapter 2, verse 10. Also, it was I who brought you up out of the land of Egypt and led you 40 years in the wilderness to possess the land of the Amorites. So here we see reference to the Exodus and to the wilderness wanderings. Let's look at chapter 3, verse 1. Hear this word that the Lord has spoken against you, all people of Israel, against the whole family that I brought up out of the land of Egypt. So again, a reference to the Exodus. Let's look at chapter 4, verse 10. I sent among you the plagues after the manner of Egypt. I killed your young men with swords and carried away your horses, and I made the stench of your camp go up into your nostrils. So here he's talking about often the prophets will use the plagues that were sent on the Egyptians during the time of the Exodus as a reference for the original hearer, the original audience, or the original reader to show them just what God did on the Egyptians back then, God will bring in judgment on you if you don't obey the law. Let's look at one more in chapter 5, verse 25. Did you not bring to me the sacrifices and offerings during the 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? And again, a reference to the time in the wilderness. So really imagine and picture yourself in their shoes and them thinking about these major historical events that were very important to their history and their identity as a people, and think, okay, why is the prophet referencing to that event? How is that significant for them? So it seems like here that God talks about the Exodus, about the wilderness wanderings to show His might, His sovereignty, and often God uses in the prophets the wilderness experience to remind the original reader of their past judgment as a picture for future judgment, which was coming because of their sins and their disobedience to the covenant. Also, another motif that's often repeated in the prophets is the reference to David, and it's often used in the salvation or promise oracles. It's usually talking about hope that's coming in the future. And we see this in chapter 9, verse 11, and it says, "In that day I will raise up the booth of David that is fallen, repair its breaches, and raise up its ruins, and rebuild it as in the days of old." And so it's a reference for the original readers to realize that there is hope, that God has a plan for them in the future. And often you see this repeated theme of the booth of David, or the branch of David, or the root of David, which often refers to Christ. But it was to remind them of the time of David, of the United Kingdom, which was the glory days of Israel, and to give them a future picture of restoration. Now, another motif that is mentioned in this book is Sodom and Gomorrah, and it's mentioned in chapter 4, verse 11. "I withdrew some of you as God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah, and you were as a brand plucked out of the burning." And so whenever Sodom and Gomorrah are mentioned in the prophets, it's always a picture of God's great judgment. Okay, the last tip number 8, all the prophet says is not prophecy. Not every word of the prophets are predictions. Much of what the prophet says are the assessments of the original hearer and of the original reader's present situation, and a call for them to come back to God and to follow the law. So that handout is available to you, and it's very helpful, I do believe. Okay, so looking more at the historical setting, Amos is unique in the sense that it is one of the earliest written prophets. It's in the 8th century BC, and it's one of the only 2 written prophets to Israel. Jeroboam II, he reigned over Israel from about 793 through 753 BC, over 41 years. Uzziah reigned over Judah for 52 years, from 750 to 739 BC. I would like to read back in 2 Kings just to give us some remembrance of what was happening during this time in Israel's history. So let's read 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 24 through 26. Okay, in verse 24, it is referring to Jeroboam II. "And he did what was evil in the sight of God. He did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebaioth, which he made Israel to sin. He restored the borders of Israel from Labo Hamath as far as the sea of Arabath, according to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, which he spoke by his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet who was from Gath Hepher. For the Lord saw the affliction of Israel was very bitter, for there was none left, bond or free, and there was none to help Israel." And so here we see that Jonah, the minor prophet book Jonah, is the same Jonah as during this time period, and that God had seen all the suffering that Israel and Judah had gone through. They had gone through the covenant curses because they had rejected the law. They were suffering so greatly. And so God, out of his mercy, he gave them a time of peace and stability. Unfortunately, though, Israel, even though it was physically strong, it was spiritually very dark. Jeroboam II of Israel was one of the most powerful kings in the Near East at this time. He had great military victories. He restored the northern borders of Israel as far as David had it during his time. So this kingdom was the largest Israel ever was since the time of David or Solomon. Israel and Judah were at peace during this time. Uzziah of Judah had conquered many of the surrounding nations, and they paid him tribute. His fame was even spread as far as Egypt. Assyria was at a low point politically and militarily during this time, so it was no major threat to Israel and Judah. So both nations, Israel and Judah, were both powerful, influential in the world. They were economically prosperous. Trade and commerce were flourishing. They were rich, powerful. So it was a good time in that sense to be an Israelite, especially if you were a rich Israelite. But it seemed like the rich were just trying to get richer, and they didn't care for the poor people of society. And so the rich became richer and the poor poorer. So this time in history was known as the Golden Age of Israel, but there was a huge problem with their spirituality, that they were not worshiping God alone. And so they were spiritually at a low point, at a dark point. So I'd like to read a couple of scriptures from Amos just to help us get a picture of seeing what kind of sins they were involved in and how low they had come spiritually. So let's turn to Amos chapter 2, and let's read verse 6 through 8. Thus says the Lord, for the 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver, and the needy for a pair of sandals, those who trample the heads of the poor into the dust of the earth, and turn aside the way of the afflicted. A man and his father go into the same girl, so that mine holy name is profaned. So we see there that the rich are abusing the poor and the needy, and there's prostitution going on. Let's go on and read chapter 3, verse 14 and 15. That on the day I punish Israel for his transgressions, I will punish the altars of Bethel, and the horns of the altar shall be cut off and fall to the ground. I will strike the winter house along with the summer house, and the houses of ivory shall perish, and the great houses shall come to an end. So here you see the wealth that became in Israel, that they had houses made of ivory, that they had a winter and a summer house. And you see the mention of the altars of Bethel, the calf, the golden calf that was made by Jeroboam I was still there, and so they were worshiping that calf at Bethel. And so you see idolatry and the abuse of the wealth. Let's also read chapter 4, verse 1. Hear the word, you cows of Bashan, those who are on the mountain of Samaria, who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to your husband, bring that we may drink. So again, abuse of the poor at the advantage of the rich women, so they get more from their husbands. Let's read chapter 4, verse 5 through 6. Come to Bethel and transgress, to Gilgal and multiply transgressions. Bring your sacrifices every morning, your tithes each 3 days, to offer the sacrifices of thanksgiving that was leavened, and proclaim free will offerings to publish them, for you love to do so, O people of Israel, declares the Lord God. So again, the imagery of idolatry. Chapter 5, verse 11. Therefore, because you trample on the poor and you exact taxes of gain from him, you have built houses of hewed stone, but you shall not dwell in them. So again, a picture of the wealth and them taking advantage of the poor and the abuse in taxing. Let's read chapter 6, verse 4 through 6. Woe to those who lie on beds of ivory and stretch themselves out on their couches, and eat lambs from the flocks and calves from the midst of the stall, who sing idle songs to the sound of the harp, like David invented for themselves instruments of music, who drink wine in bowls and anoint themselves with the finest oils. but are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. So here you can imagine the wealthy people laying on their couch and drinking wine and singing these idle songs because they become so wealthy and filled their pockets that they just have too much leisure time and to do whatever they want, but to forget about the destruction that's coming to Judah. And then let's look at chapter 8, verse 4 through 6. Hear this, you who trample on the needy, who bring the poor of the land to an end, saying, when will be the new moon be over, that we may sell grain? The Sabbath, that we may offer wheat for sale, that we may take the ephah small and the shekel great, and deal deceitfully with the false balance, that we may buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and sell the chaff of the wheat. So again, the rich taking advantage of the poor, of the wrongness of them, their false balance, of their corruption that is involved here. Also in Amos chapter 5 verse 26, it talks about other gods. We see in Amos 3:11, chapter 6 verse 1 through 2, how they feel secure in their military might, that they're a strong, a great nation. So in the prophets, from the list that you see, you can understand more about the social and the religious problems that those people or that audience that prophet's talking to. So from these lists of sins, we can see that the audience of Amos, the Israel and Bethel, that there is wealth, there idleness, there's social injustice, there's corruption in the courts, there's bribery, the rich take advantage of the poor, there's great division between the rich and poor, they worship the calves in Bethel, they worship other idols, there's political, religious, and social leaders are leading them into sin. And it's because they serve Baal and Asher and they practice self-indignation or self-indulgence. So they are people who have no regard for anyone other than themselves. So their two main sins at this time is idolatry and social injustice. And often these two sins go hand in hand. And it shows that the rich were not concerned about anyone else, but just filling their pockets and just enjoying their own life and having their own pleasure and not thinking of others. And so here, God sees this great social injustice. They see the wealthy taking advantage of their wealth instead of helping others. God sees their idolatry. And so God, who can I send to speak my message to these people? And God called Amos. Now we want to talk about how do you find the big picture and a key verse for a prophet? Well, each prophet, of course, has the three main themes of sin, judgment, and restoration in each book. But when you think of each individual book, you want to think about what is that prophet saying specifically? What makes this prophet unique to the other prophets? What is the main sin that the prophet is addressing in this book? Often, of course, it's idolatry. That's probably consistent throughout all the prophetic books. But there's often one main sin or one main focus that prophet is talking about. For example, in Amos, it's dealing with social injustice. So that is one idea that makes Amos unique. So look for a key verse or an idea that relates to that main idea. So the big picture of Amos is that judgment is coming because of their social injustice and idolatry. Amos spoke these prophecies to call Israel back to repentance and to warn them of God's coming judgment because of their pride, of their wealth, their abuse, social injustice, and idolatry. You know, Amos faced a common problem that we have in the Western world. It depends on where you are or which society you're in, but if you go and minister into a Western world, people have what they need. They think they have everything. They don't need God. They're comfortable, they're secure, And so when you talk about God, often people are like, I don't need God. Whereas when you go to other countries where there are more needs, there are more insecurities and more uncertainties of life, people are more readily open to God. And so in a sense, those of us who live in a Western world can really relate to what Amos is saying here. So who is Amos? Well, we saw in chapter 1, verse 1, that he was a shepherd from Tekoa. We can find more information about him from Amos chapter 7. So let's read chapter 7, verse 14 and 15. And it says, When Amos answered and said to Amonias, I was no prophet, nor a prophet's son, but I was a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore figs. But the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, Go, prophesy to my people of Israel. And so we see that he was a shepherd and a dresser of sycamore figs, and God called him to go to Israel. He wasn't from a family of prophets. He wasn't a prophet for his profession like Isaiah and Jeremiah, but so most likely his ministry was short. Tekoa was a small farming town southwest of Jerusalem in Judah. And so the spiritual condition in Israel was so bad that God had to call a shepherd from Judah to come and to share his message with them. Most likely Amos was wealthy because of his profession. And we see that he knows what's happening in the world because of his knowledge of the nations around in chapters 1 and 2 of Amos. And he knew what was going on in Israel. He knew their past history, and he knew the sins that they were experiencing now. And you see those details throughout the book. So what happened to Israel after Amos prophesied and after Jeremiah the second? Well, it actually goes down the drain really quick. Because in 30 years after this book was spoken, Israel fell to Assyria and was taken into exile in 722 BC.